Welcome to the Thinking in Between podcast, where we explore the terrain between health and social science. In each episode, we're joined by a researcher working in this space to hear about three big ideas that have changed their thinking and their research. And today, I'm glad to be joined by Dr Natassia Brenman, a senior qualitative researcher based in the Nuffield Department of Primary Care Health Sciences at the University of Oxford. Would you be able to just say a bit about your journey so far and what you've been up to in your career to date?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. So my first degree was in psychology, and although I was kind of very studious and got through it, I kind of hated it. I was kind of really, I was sort of put off by how sort of reductionist and sort of the attempts to kind of cut out the noise of the social world. Right. And I was really sort of shocked by it because I thought, psychology, it's so interesting. I was at University of Sussex. It was sort of known for being quite radical and critical. But anyway, I did a couple of modules in sort of sociology and philosophy, and that was probably enough to kind of spark an interest in this kind of critical social science perspective. But also I think it's fair to say that I think studying psychology also really sort of set in motion a real interest in sort of, I guess, what's known as the Psy disciplines, the psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy, which I then have gone on to do a lot of research into. And so having sort of graduated, I actually was kind of done with academia, I thought. Moved to Amsterdam, worked in the NGO world in sort of like global health. And then, I guess I've heard a lot of people talk about this kind of messy pathway in academia. I was basically working in a research and development role, and people were saying, why did you sort of drop out of your studies? And that's because in that context, everyone basically does a master's.
Right.
And they were kind of going, well, you better get your master's because okay. And I heard a lot of people talking about this thing called medical anthropology, and I didn't even really know what it was. But I kind of soon realised that Amsterdam was this amazing hub for medical anthropology. It was where Anna-Marie Moll, who's come up quite a few times in the podcast, I think, was, and others. And so I ended up doing a master's in medical anthropology and sociology, and kind of got back into academia. When I moved to London to do my PhD, I was at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, studying with Simon Cohn, another person that's come up in the podcast. And so anyway, this podcast really resonates in terms of that intersection between sort of the medical world and social sciences, because I really found myself in that space. And did my PhD. It was looking at issues around access to mental health services, very much based in the voluntary sector. So it was kind of community-based. It was all around kind of space and place, and it was sort of very grounded in the community. And then my sort of postdoctoral work, and since then, was much more in this kind of technology and more sort of biomedical space. And so that was looking, and I'll talk a bit more about it in the rest of the conversation, but that was looking at sort of dementia prevention technologies and drug development. Mm-hmm. It's still kind of carrying on this theme of sort of critical thinking about sort of diagnostic categories in psychiatry and psychology, but very different context. And since then, I've been doing various projects around sort of health and technology. And my current work, I'm back to sort of looking at access and kind of thresholds and diagnosis and what that does for sort of access to care, but in primary care.
Okay.
And we've been looking with myself and colleagues in the department at sort of the digitalisation of NHS primary care and sort of access and triage. And I'm currently leading a project looking at the role of technology, digital and remote care, particularly in the context of patients that have been specifically sort of deregistered or excluded from usual GP care from sort of alleged sort of bad behaviour, basically.
Okay.
Still kind of looking at issues around access and exclusion, but in that particular context.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your work through the ideas you're bringing today. And the first idea that you brought is George Canguilhem's work on the normal and the pathological. So Could you tell us a bit about what this work articulates, and then a bit about how it shaped your own thinking?
Yeah, sure. So this was a book that sort of got handed to me by my master's supervisor, actually, who's a medical anthropologist who did a lot of work in sort of critical disability studies and deaf studies. And I mean, I thought it was cool at the time because she told me that George Canguilhem was Michel Foucault's PhD supervisor.
Okay.
So I thought, it must be really great. And it is this very dense sort of intricate, it's very different to Foucault, very kind of intricate, modest sort of history of science and philosophy of science and medicine. But it's, at its core, it's got this really simple idea, a seemingly simple idea, but that I think is really quite profound. And that is that sort of health and illness don't kind of work along this continuum of sort of normal and abnormal in terms of a kind of statistical measure of the norm. And although sort of biomedicine is often about sort of finding a sort of biological marker of a disease and then looking at the normal range, and anything outside of that is sort of pathological. In fact, he talks about health being much more about how we do or don't adapt to our environment. So right. In the end, you get this kind of much more fluid and lively idea about health that is much more contingent on context, which is, of course, just such a precursor for so much of the work we do in social sciences. And I think, yeah, you know, for example, you know, you really see that coming out in things like social model of disability, where like a body that might not be normal might be seen as sort of pathological in one context, but actually if the context is sort of accessible and, you know, you can adapt to that, then of course that's not pathological, that's just different.
And did I guess just as you were starting to then look at these ideas in your PhD work, did that start to kind of have any resonance there? Looking at the categories.
Yeah, absolutely. So I found it kind of really resonated with that kind of critical thinking about sort of in mental health and psychiatry. Sort of, there's been many attempts to try and find a kind of biological markers and kind of definitive biological markers for mental health and illness, but also the kind of statistical model of diagnosis. And that has been particularly prominent in that field of health because, you know, that there is no kind of one objective way of defining kind of mental illness. And so looking at it in this way really shows the frictions between the kind of lab-defined sort of pathology versus, you know, being in the world and the kind of much more kind of lively and interactional ways of looking at sort of health and illness. And so, I mean, that's kind of the kind of more obvious way in which you can sort of see where that has use. But I was actually going to talk about in my postdoc as well. That was really surprising because I was there looking at something that was sort of supposed to be a much more biologically grounded pathology, which was sort of Alzheimer's disease, which increasingly, you know, there are kind of biomarkers associated with that. And I was really fascinated when I sort of got involved in that work. We were working with participants who were sort of at risk of dementia. So in that they didn't have the disease, but they were in this kind of pre-disease state. So either due to their age or because they had like a particular protein that had been found in their brain that kind of puts them in this kind of category of, sort of pre-dementia, but they don't have any symptoms.
Right.
So that kind of really reminded me of that, and it helped myself and the colleague that I was working with think about these people's experience of being in this kind of pre-disease state, their kind of participation in this sort of long-term study, not in this kind of biologically defined kind of pre-disease to sort of pre-dementia to having a kind of diagnosis, then to having having the disease, but rather in the context of their lives and their expectations and their experience of kind of time and temporality in a much more sort of context-specific way.
And did you see any examples of sort of resistance to that, I guess, push to be pathologized into this particular category of, you are pre-diseased or indeed you're moving into this form of disease? Was there any, I guess, taking that kind of more fluid approach which aligns more with, I guess, a social model of disability in your work in Alzheimer's? Did you see any work either by individuals who had I don't want to say the disease, the pre-disease, or by some of the clinicians looking after them who were critical of those categories that they were either being placed in or placing people in?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting because I think that people didn't explicitly sort of critique that. I think they probably also because they were then sort of seen as healthy volunteers that were sort of signing up to the study. So everyone was very much on board with that kind of biomedically defined sort of scale, but at the same time they would talk about why they were part of the trial, and that was so much more connected to, for example, someone would be talking about, well, I live on my own, I'm thinking about my own future in relation to kind of my situation at home and kind of speculating about what might happen. And so it was very much kind of the affordances of that trial and those sort of potential drugs which hadn't been developed yet, but it was very much in the context of how they would adapt in their own lives rather than kind of whether they certainly will or won't get it or when or...
Yes.
And I think for me also one of the most interesting things as well was that once you've sort of decoupled that kind of lab defined by the kind of lived experience, you can also look at the context in which the lab defined measure of pathology happens. So another piece of work that we were doing was also looking at these kind of shifting thresholds of what is the disease. And actually once you then take it away from it just representing the disease, we were also able to look at how it was kind of contingent on this very sort of political, speculative work of drug development.
Yes.
And so, that was really interesting as well there to kind of look at the kind of politics of how that comes to be as well.
Could you say a bit more about that? Because I find this whole area of how these sort of taken for granted categories that just look like they are the thing, this is the definition, but how those definitions actually get formed by often not very many people at quite a particular moment in quite a particular space. Could you say a bit more about what you found and learned about how those definitions of what the pathological was actually got shaped?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a big story there, but there's, so we were working with a bunch of kind of clinical trialists and also sort of biomedical researchers, and they were all kind of working with this sort of idea, this kind of the amyloid hypothesis around kind of this particular protein in the brain and how that may or may not play into the development of dementia and Alzheimer's. And at the same time as developing this theory, you're also working with a pharmaceutical company that are developing drugs. And so we sort of found that there was like a huge amount of speculative work thinking about the drug that has not actually yet been made. So kind of this tension between sort of care and cure. And so that there is no cure, but there is this kind of working towards a potential cure. And so the kind of shifting boundaries around like what dementia is very much connected to this kind of very sort of speculative work about what drug might be developed and might become on the market. And that is a huge amount of kind of invisible, well, to me and to most people, invisible actors involved in that that maybe aren't kind of seen on first glance. So that was really fascinating.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to say on this idea before we move on to your next one?
No, I think that we can move on. Thanks.
Thank you. So the second idea that you've chosen today starts from an introduction to a collection of essays on inventive methods. And this introduction is from Lury and Wakeford. So how does this chapter reframe the use and the role of methods, and how has it shaped how you think about methods?
Yeah, so this was, again, something I came across in my PhD. I think it came out of a kind of event at Goldsmiths in kind of the early 2010s. But it's really a call to think about kind of research methods, which can be sort of this quite dry sort of nuts and bolts of how we kind of do research to try and sort of represent the world. But it's a call to kind of move away from thinking about methods as a way to kind of neutrally represent the world, and think about them actually as ways that you can kind of engage with and participate in and sort of creatively intervene in the world. Right. So we kind of, as researchers, rather than making ourselves kind of passive observers of the world, actually to kind of embrace this way in which that you can kind of participate in and collaborate with your research participants, and sort of particularly in social research, and how that can actually specifically be for kind of for change. And I mean, it's interesting. I was focusing on just the introductory chapter, so it's a sort of edited volume, and it's got various chapters by sort of social researchers, sort of intersection of social research and science and technology studies. So people like Lucy Suchman and Mike Michaels and Norcia Mars, who write. Some of them write about kind of more classic sort of creative methods, so things like sort of photo elicitation, and others are kind of much more sort of abstract. So there's kind of speculation as method, and that was actually, I've talked about sort of speculation in the sort of previous idea, so that's kind of more abstract. And then there are others that talk about things that seem like kind of very small details, or sort of just the equipment of research, like lists or a tape recorder, and they kind of make more of actually their kind of inventive, creative potential.
Right. Wow. So could you say, just picking up on those last points, like how would something like a tape recorder or a list, how would that shape the world differently? Yeah.
So so one of them I'll actually pick up on one of the other chapters that I've used specifically, and that was the anecdote. And so that is something that was Mike Michaels' chapter, I think. That is seen as quite sort of low on the hierarchy of like evidence often, but actually the way in which sort of an anecdote can kind of come into being in the social world, but also how as a researcher you can kind of participate in the kind of passing on of information and narrativizing and sort of storytelling, and there can also be kind of a liveliness and a kind of a humour to that, rather than just trying to create a kind of facsimile of like the reality.
Right.
And well, yeah, I can talk a bit more about how I've taken this to mean, and well, maybe just before I move on to that, I just kind of put it into the context of I've used it in teaching as well.
Okay.
And so I worked with a colleague, a sort of arts and humanities scholar, and we used it in some teaching that we did at the Royal College of Art, and that it kind of had a sort of obvious, sort of resonated kind of more obviously with sort of art students, because it's very sort of practice-based and creative. But I actually, one of the reasons why I chose it for this podcast, I think it can actually have more use in kind of at this intersection between kind of social science and medicine, because I think it talks about kind of interventions, but in a really different way to how you kind of think about interventions in sort of like randomized controlled trials and things, where you try and sort of like have a targeted intervention, but you try and really control that.
Yes.
And that is then the kind of anything else that comes in that's unexpected is kind of seen as sort of noise or mess.
Yes.
And so, yeah, that's just kind of one of the reasons why I chose it here. And I used it in my PhD, where I kind of mentioned that I was quite interested in the sort of materiality of space and place, and I developed a sort of creative method of sort of mapping spaces of care and getting people to kind of sketch out and visually map places to try and think about those aspects of people's experiences of access and belonging and So and one of the things that I learned from this text was not to sort of try and see these maps as a sort of set representation of the place and kind of, or even a set of kind of perspectives on a place, but actually a kind of collaborative process. So the data was the actual collaborative process of mapping and talking through and thinking, and actually that being part of kind of placemaking. And so the kind of findings are not around, oh, that's funny, they saw that as that, but actually it's like this, but more, that person's sense of kind of vulnerability or precarity is actually really came out in the process of pointing this out or describing that, or so it's very much a kind of much more lively and, you know, can open up the research method to sort of unexpected things coming up, and you're kind of not trying to control it, but rather kind of let things be much more emergent.
Can you say a bit more about the teaching example, just to understand a bit more about what would happen in those sessions when you were with the art students?
Yeah, so we did a lot of thinking about kind of bringing in like objects that might help you think about your research problem. And like one of the things I think that they say is trying to think about how you can make your kind of research questions answerable in different ways. So you can kind of go like, there is not necessarily kind of one answer, but there's like different ways of framing it so that you can, let the kind of answers emerge in kind of lots of different ways.
Would you be able to say about what you meant by anecdote as methods? I don't know if you've got a particular anecdote of that in your own research.
Yeah, so I use that in to kind of make sense of a particular experience that I'd had. So I was working with a service user in one of these community-based mental health services, and through the kind of mapping of the space, she'd included something that when I spoke to staff members afterwards, they said, that particular object wasn't there. But it brought up an anecdote about a particular person who shouldn't have been in that space. And it was unclear whether that person had or hadn't been there, or whether they should or shouldn't have been in the space. And there was kind of a mismatch often between different people's stories. And rather than that becoming something that you think, oh, well, I can't include this because it's not reliable, it sort of opened up this whole story that, again, I never even knew like what was particularly true or not true. And people have written a lot about kind of rumour and gossip and what we can learn from that. And there's something very generative about being able to be interested in sort of anecdotes or stories, not kind of shutting it off and being, we have this kind of, I find kind of horrible phrase in kind of research methods about triangulation, that you want to make all of the sort of data match up.
Yes.
And I think that actually in social research and ethnography in particular, it's actually amazing when you find that those kind of different forms of data don't match up.
Yes.
You can look at the frictions and the tensions, and actually often like a whole new kind of set of, whether it's kind of stories or kind of themes emerge out of that.
Yes.
And for me, there was a kind of, a whole kind of ethics and moral question about who belongs where that wouldn't have come out if I hadn't been interested in this kind of tenuous piece of information.
It really makes me think about how, I guess, some of the ways in which most pieces of even sort of social or qualitative research tend to fit in within a few categories of methods, and some particularly represented, and then others still quite represented, but very rarely to kind of traverse into all sorts of different, just completely new ways of doing things, might be partly just, I guess it's a bit of a scary thing to kind of go off-grid or off-piste from those methods, but also maybe there's sometimes something about, we're often kind of facing that difficulty of trying to be credible to audiences that don't fully understand what we're trying to do. And I was struck by your comment there about triangulation, because I remember first reading that in a qualitative textbook and being like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, of course, triangulation, that makes sense. And then reading a critique of it, being like, oh yeah, no, that doesn't necessarily make sense, because I'm not trying to find out this kind of stable, solid truth that everyone agrees on, because I don't know that that's a thing. But I wonder if, I don't know, an example like that means that there's maybe a nervousness sometimes to allow ourselves to embrace what possible methods there are of doing things, and even methods that don't even feel like they would meet the sort of, I don't know, the bar of what a method should be, especially when speaking to colleagues outside of the area that we're working in. But maybe there is a call to just trust that we will learn things that we couldn't learn another way by embracing these sort of ways of doing methods differently.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. And I think the kind of this idea of methods being inventive, there's also a kind of interesting kind of reflection on kind of sort of ideas about like the experiment or sort of science and technology, and actually that like the social sciences actually can also be kind of inventive or generative. It's in the same way as science and technology kind of tries to think about, oh, how can we produce something new?
Right. Yes.
So I guess that's a way to kind of think about it. It's not just a kind of another way of trying to create like objective knowledge about the world, but actually that you might be able to kind of produce new ways of thinking and telling stories.
Yes, I like that. Like, it's not a new compound or a new device as such, but it may still be in that thing of doing something that no one's done before that creates a new space for possibility. Yeah, that's fascinating. Is there anything else you would like to say about this idea?
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Actually, can I ask you one more thing? In the work you're doing now, or perhaps just in recent times, have there been any other times that you found yourself trying a new method or something that doesn't even feel like it's necessarily a method, but you realise afterwards, oh, that was really important or significant in learning something new or creating something new, even though it didn't fit rigidly into the category of the interview or the participant observation? Or I just wonder if you've had any experiences since that time that have touched on that. Yeah,
I mean, the recent project that we did on sort of digital and remote GP care, and also kind of around access and triage, we didn't use a kind of creative method, but we used kind of team ethnography. So we were working in a team, and we went into doctor surgeries, and one of the things that was really helpful about working as a team was that we were able to track these processes of accessing and getting a GP appointment and then triaging them. And one of the things that we kind of used the whole team for was very pragmatic, which was just, oh wow, actually there's many different points that we have to cover. And in doing that, what it really helped to bring out is the kind of very distributed nature of triaging that has emerged with the introduction of digital tools, which has really expanded the sort of spatial and temporal dynamics. So, for example, where it used to be, you know, someone might turn up and then they would just book an appointment at, you know, at a single place and time. Now people will fill in an online consultation form at home. That will be kind of then in a kind of digital package that can then travel through space and time. And then it will arrive with kind of a receptionist. And then this is where we were kind of tracking the journey of it. It will actually not just be then booked into the schedule of the GP, but actually it can quite often it will be repackaged into a kind of a new computer system maybe, and then it will go to another part of the kind of support team, and then it will go to a triage doctor. That will then be processed in a certain way, sort of datafied, as people quite often call it. And so rather than seeing triage as a kind of single decision point, it actually revealed something really important about the nature of the kind of distributed nature of decision making.
Yes, and doing that as a team allowed you to see that in a way that would have been different to being one ethnographer in that study?
Yeah, and I just think there's definitely something about what might kind of seem as sort of like a mundane sort of practicality about, oh, actually, how are we going to do this? Okay, well, you're going to have to go up there and we're going to have to message each other and sort of, and there was a sort of mirroring there of the kind of distributed nature of digitally enabled triage.
Thank you. So the third idea that you're sharing today is the brilliantly named Cyborgs and Goddesses, which was first articulated by Donna Haraway and then more recently by Jasbir Puar. So, what are Cyborgs and Goddesses? What is this work speaking to, and how have they influenced you?
So this is a kind of really interesting ongoing kind of conversation. I guess it's part of a sort of alternative canon of sort of feminist scholars in sort of science and technology studies. And it's really all about the kind of question about how bodies and identities kind of come into being in the world, rather than kind of the body as being a sort of signifier of a kind of particular fixed category. And so, should we start with Haraway?
Yeah, let's do it.
I mean, Haraway was the Cyborg Manifesto was something that, when I came across it, I was studying, I found it really fun, but it actually took me ages to kind of think about how it could be sort of used. And Jasbir Puar, which we'll come on to, was really putting it into a context that you can apply, and very much kind of fits into kind of contemporary theory. But so Donna Haraway proposes this kind of figure of the cyborg as a kind of cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, and a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. And she kind of has this very tongue-in-cheek style where it kind of really argues for pleasure in the confusion of boundaries, but also taking responsibility for their construction. And you can tell this is like it's a great. I mean, it's called a manifesto for a reason, because it's like sort of quite polemic. And there have been lots of sort of critiques and debates about what it is, but basically it's all about sort of undermining the binaries that get us stuck in identity categories. And I have really found that so valuable in my thinking about all sorts of categories of person and how they kind of come into healthcare, and whether it's sort of categories of marginality or sort of patient groups. And as social scientists, often even when we're trying to be sort of see that as very kind of complex or intersectional, I think we can quite often fall into these kind of traps of fixed categories. And it's not helped by the fact that funders are kind of constantly asking us, who is your patient group? What kind of particular category of disadvantage are you looking at? And so it is a kind of constant struggle to try and think about this. So anyway, the last line of that essay by Donna Haraway is, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess. Right. And that is all about sort of the particular kind of category that she's interested in is this sort of the figure of the woman and how it's been used in kind of feminist thinking. And she's really arguing for sort of chucking out this sort of racialized, matriarchal, kind of naturalized figure of femininity, and argues instead for this sort of hybridity and impurity and kind of machine, human, sci-fi figure instead. And well, we can come pick up on it, but that's where Jasbir Puar picked up on, and that's what's in the title of her essay.
Yeah, wow. Well, I don't know which is better to go first, either that, or I'd really love to hear you speak particularly to that concept of the marginalised group, because I feel like that is a taken for granted category that I definitely regularly use as a category, but I want to hear more about that. So I don't know which is the better order to do it. But either tell me more about the work by Jasbir Puar, if that's going to help answer that, or if you can use that as an example for how that category can be challenged and seen more fluidly.
Yeah, so, well, I'll just say that, like, I think probably, so in my PhD and projects since, it's definitely been something that's kind of come up as, often it's a kind of important choice in your kind of research questions. And just to say, like, it's not a criticism of trying to pick up on these particular groups or categories, because there is often ethical imperative in trying to define that, and I think that's kind of where you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Right. In that, like, this all comes from trying to think about how sort of social justice, basically, and often you can't do that without trying to identify where that lies. I will talk. Yeah, so that's the kind of the problem.
Yes.
And the tension there. And I'll just kind of briefly talk about Puar's paper, because that puts it particularly in the context of assemblage theory, and she puts that forward as a kind of potential, not solution, but way, kind of a theory to think with, that tries to maintain the kind of progress that's been made by thinking about marginalised categories, whether that's kind of women or kind of racialised categories, and then sort of intersectionality theory. I'm not going to go into another theory, but then the kind of tensions that can have with other ways of thinking about it, which is not about kind of fixed categories, but more about the way that they kind of come into being. And so assemblage theory, I feel like we can maybe direct regular listeners.
Yes, absolutely, to Jackie. Jackie
Willoughby's episode, and I'm also going to use that as an excuse not to go into the and guitar.
Very good idea. Yeah.
But in assemblage theory, kind of one of the things that this does is it doesn't kind of privilege bodies as kind of humans or even kind of categories, particular categories of human, but rather it thinks about all sorts of materials in the world. And sometimes you hear people talking about kind of matter. And what's really key here is that bodies and matter aren't fixed things, but they're in this constant state of becoming. And so, for example, I was looking at, so in my PhD, I was looking at, how particular kind of marginalised groups were served by kind of community organisations. Often, again, those organisations were run kind of for and by the communities that they served. And so looking at those categories were like absolutely vital in providing access and specialised care to people who really needed it. So again, like not wanting to kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater. So, for example, kind of women's centre or centre for that's specialised in providing psychotherapeutic care for migrants and refugees, and sort of in kind of their mother tongue, so like people's own languages. But what was really interesting for me is to look at those kind of spaces of care and how they were kind of created as sort of places of kind of belonging and welcome, but also the kind of tensions and struggles that they found within the healthcare system. And so part of their kind of marginal position in the healthcare system, and the way I've spoken about, they had to kind of move around because of like rising rent and not having kind of core costs and having to kind of bid for contracts. and then how that filtered down through care providers and service users' experiences of that, how marginality also emerged through those practices and the kind of materiality of care in those spaces, rather than there being kind of categories of marginalisation that you would then plop them into these places as kind of boxes where that category kind of fitted, but rather that kind of the marginality would also emerge out of those particular contexts.
Right. So as in, it's not. Am I understanding it rightly to be like the services provided would in some ways make marginality more of a solid category than it had been had those services not that they're worsening it, but just that it becomes more of a clear category because of the existence of the services for those groups?
I guess, yeah, and that it's, this kind of constant state of becoming idea is that it's not, they exist because these services exist, but that actually in the mess of the social world, actually that experience will be kind of reproduced as that goes on. And I guess what you can take from that is that, yes, whilst there is a real imperative for that to be there, if you take a step back, you can go, what might that be kind of reproducing in doing so? Another thing that I think in my more recent research, I've also been really interested in the idea of kind of the complex patient. So again, something that's really important to look at, kind of complex patients. So not just sort of your average patient who's coming into primary care, it might be kind of visiting the doctor once a year. But, people with kind of multiple and complex needs. It's a lot about kind of multimorbidity and kind of complexity there. But one of the things that I'm really keen to think about is the relationship between the complex patient and complex systems, and how they're kind of increasingly complex and fragmented with the introduction of kind of new technologies and digitalization, and how, actually that's not necessarily a kind of fixed category. So there might be someone who, and we've spoken a lot about this in our team, that might have not necessarily been seen as complex, but then with the introduction of kind of digital health and the expectation to kind of use technology and engage remotely, might bring up other aspects kind of around kind of communication, or the kind of the way in which the consultation is complex. And I really sort of would like to think more about how the complex patient kind of emerges in this kind of state of becoming out of a kind of increasingly complex and fragmented system. And that's really interesting, because it's less about kind of locale and sort of specific sort of material, but much more distributed context of remote technologies.
It makes me think about the first idea we discussed again as well of the sort of normal and the pathological, and it feels like maybe this is another using that same critique, I guess, of like how much is complexity owned by an individual, how much is that in the life of a person, and how much is that the context in which they're placed into, and I guess a little bit like briefly touched on it with mental health categories, or even with categories of Alzheimer's. It feels like seeing that again in some ways of the extent to which a complex patient only becomes that because of, as you say, the system they're in. And I guess also just thinking back to what you were saying before about the way in which the service is provided to people that have that name on the tin of this is for a marginalised group. In the same way, once you've got a category and a term called the complex patient, does that itself start to solidify the complex patient status of an individual in a way that wouldn't necessarily have happened if that word and that term and that category didn't exist before?
Yeah, and I think there's also something even trickier in that often it can take on the sort of slightly sort of negative qualities of kind of previous categories. So I think sometimes there is a sort of euphemistic quality of talking about kind of complex,
Yes.
that can also be sort of around difficult or kind of other things that might describe kind of more within person sort of qualities.
Yes.
But that can be, actually within that kind of be sort of, I think the experience of hearing that and the kind of label of that can also be quite tricky.
Yes. And I wonder as well if sometimes it's a way of, when a clinician uses the term, it's sometimes perhaps a bit of a expression of their own frustration or feeling of limitation in the system they're working into. The complexity is also maybe sometimes a euphemism for I feel overwhelmed, myself in what to do for this person here. And I don't know if it's quite, I don't know if boundary work's the right term of kind of saying, I don't know if I can, if I'm able to really take on this case in its fullness. But there's, I don't know, I wonder if there's something as well about a term like that is also the fears and the anxieties of the clinician on the other side of the table. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually right, because I think the context of kind of complexity within systems is not just experienced by patients, but it's also experienced by staff. So colleagues in our research group have written a paper around sort of techno stress experienced by primary care staff. And also particularly support staff as well. So but absolutely GPs. I've been observing GPs doing, also at the kind of most highly trained GPs as well, kind of doing triage. It's like the kind of emotional load there is massive as well. So it's definitely not just patients that experience that kind of complexity of system, but it's also staff. And I wonder if, by taking it away from kind of descriptors of sort of individuals or bodies, that actually there can be more acknowledgement of the kind of more distributed effects of technology through kind of relationships rather than on kind of individuals.
Thank you. So is there anything else that you'd like to say about this third idea?
Yeah, I guess sort of thinking about this figure of the complex patient in the context of the project that I'm currently working on. And that's a similar project looking at kind of access and the use of remote and or kind of in-person care, particularly in this context of services for patients that have been removed from their usual doctor list through kind of instance of violence or aggression or alleged violence or aggression. And those patients have often got kind of what's known as multiple and complex needs, and that's something that I think is really important to acknowledge. At the same time, not kind of making that into kind of one particular patient group. And I think what I'm always really interested in is how technologies might, and we've talked about kind of reproducing existing inequalities, but also bringing up kind of new patterns of sort of inclusion or exclusion, perhaps in sort of unexpected ways. So I'm really interested in how that project will unfold, looking at the use of kind of digital and remote in that context, and how that may or may not feed into the kind of the category of the complex patient and the kind of experiences of inclusion and exclusion that come with that, perhaps in different configurations with the introduction of these new technologies.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming and speaking on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, it's been great.
And thank you everyone for listening, and we'll be back with another episode soon.